My regards to all of you out there. This is Margie Falanruw. Thank you for including me in this meeting. I will present observations of Marianas wildlife from the later 50s to the early 70s. The main objective is to describe the more abundant wildlife and opportunities for basic work in earlier days when there were few biologists. In contrast, today there are many more biologists doing much more sophisticated work on the dwindling wildlife in the Marianas. This presentation is kind of the Wild West days and provides a prelude to the presentation by Mike Gowell, who will cover the next 50 years and the transition to more order. In the 1950s, our family lived at Social Tumuni, where the big mall is now being built. The area behind our showgrounds was mostly a native forest, with the local farm, Lancho, nestled in the forest. Even in this semi-urban area, there was an abundance of birds. On Sundays, I would go to the area of the forest below the old Naval Air Station and listen to a church choir accompanied by native bird songs. The call of the late Guam broadbill was especially loud for such a small bird. The call of the Marianas crow would lure us into the forest to watch them. Most of those birds are now very rare or gone. My brother became a fisherman, and he and his buddies could get large catches, including bumphead parrotfish and humphead wrasses. These beautiful big fish could be seen from Two Lovers Leap, swimming between the reef spurs. Coconut crabs and fruit bats were hunted, especially in the limestone forest near Anderson. Old timers will remember when a large colony of fruit bats flew over Dededo village. Guys ran to get their rifles, and it sounded like the 4th of July. In those days, hunting and fishing on Guam were relatively unrestricted. A new kind of snake was being seen in southern Guam. And to earn money towards a college education, I started displaying brown tree snakes at the Liberation Day Carnival. I graduated from the University of California at Santa Barbara in 1965 and returned to Guam. By this time, the brown tree snake was no longer a novelty. The forest had been bulldozed to build that big drainage channel that goes under the airport road. American biologists were talking about a decline in birds. At first, I thought they just didn't know how to see birds, but it became clear that they knew what they were doing, and indeed there were fewer birds. I went on field trips with Dr. Ben Stone, who was working on the floor of Guam. At that time, the forest at Retidian was thriving and so dense that one could not walk through it. Here, Dr. Stone emerges from that dense forest. The shrub community at the Cotal Reserve was a wonderland of tall native endemic shrubs and short trees. It's quite different now. I was fortunate to overlap with some of the grand old biologists. About 1966, the time of the Pacific Island Science Congress in Tokyo, a number of these greats converged on Guam and Palau for a symposium on island ecosystems. That's Dr. Fosberg on a field trip in Palau. On Guam, the group was taken on field trips to visit Retidian and another conservation area up around Jigo called Ipiga. At the tip of Retidian Point, there used to be a tower. Dr. Fosberg and I climbed the tower, and he pointed out the general location of a rare tree called Cereanthes nelsoni. Later, as curator of the herbarium that Dr. Stone had started, I began going to Retidian to find the Cereanthes tree. The day I found it, I first spotted it from the tower by its abundant red flowers. It was thriving then, and I followed the sound of birds in its canopy through the very dense forest. I was so happy to find it, but unlike today, hardly anyone was interested in that tree. On one trip, I found 2 more trees at the edge of the forest along the road. I sent seeds to Dr. Stone, who was then at the University of Malaya, and he later wrote that several saplings were doing well at the botanical gardens. On a later trip to Retidian, I found that the 2 cereanthes trees along the road had been bulldozed. Why? I don't know what happened to the reserve at Ipiga, and we all know what's happening now at Retidian. When I worked at Retidian with Jennifer Cruz some years back, I was shocked by the more open nature of the forest that you could just walk through. I had worked with the Forest Service to develop vegetation maps for Rhoda, Tinian, and Saipan. On Rhoda, the late doctor and poet William Pegg showed us a patch of cereanthes trees. On Saipan, I was eating lunch in the forest below Suicide Cliff when a megapode came cluck-cooing along and shared my ship biscuits. The bird hadn't been seen in many, many years. While I was working on the herpetofauna of Guam, I went along on a Marine Lab trip to Cocos Island and collected a big Imoya skink and a number of Parachirus geckos that I hadn't seen on mainland Guam. The geckos were very abundant on coconut trunks just below the leaves. I sent the skink to Dr. Walter Brown at the California Academy of Science, and in due time, we published on the species Imoya sleveni. From childhood, I had observed gecko behavior, and at UOG, I began studying Lepidodactylus lugubris. These geckos were more plentiful prior to the spread of the more aggressive Humidactylus geckos, and someone had collected a large number of specimens. I dissected them and found that they were all female. Nonetheless, I had observed that they carry out elaborate courtship and mating behavior. I wondered if the mating behavior of the all-female population was somehow necessary for them to lay eggs. With the help of Elsa and the late Mike Sabbath, we constructed an array of gecko cages on the roof of the science building, and I raised geckos either alone in a cage or paired. It turned out that the lone geckos laid more eggs. While teaching at the University of Guam, Department of Biology, we heard rumblings about an upcoming Earth Day and decided to join the effort. We got a flag with an image of the Earth and arranged a number of events, including a tour of environmental problems for senators and other leaders. When we raised the Earth flag on April 22nd, 1970, the world's first Earth Day began on Guam, where America's Day begins. I took that flag with me to Yap, where it has been flown on Earth Days, most Earth Days at least, ever since. Dr. Jones and the late Dr. Tsuda and I created an environmental biology course at the University of Guam, and Dave Hotaling of the Guam Science Teachers Association got support to produce a series of booklets on life on Guam. Later, I was hired by the South Pacific Commission and assigned to develop an environmental education program for village schools throughout the Pacific, and I was able to expand on one of the books I did for the Life on Guam series into a whole education program. Dr. Fosberg had said that if I ever had a chance to go to the volcanic Northern Marianas, I should go. I made 4 trips by boat and an aerial flight. The field trips resulted in publications on a new species of Terminalia tree, the distribution of the endemic Marianas megapode, the vegetation of Asuncion, and the flora of the volcanic Northern Marianas. Slide 11, the next slide, shows the forested side of Asuncion Island and my brother standing near the large Terminalia tree. The next slide shows the other side of Asuncion and 2 megapode birds. I was able to photograph both the chick and the adult megapode on Asuncion. And despite what the bird books say about the flightless megapode, both of these birds flew away. There were also megapodes on Pagan, where the residents ate their eggs. This slide shows the caldera of Mount Pagan, a place that no longer exists after it erupted. and a view of the southern part of Pagan from the summit. I was able to get ashore on Uracas, the last island in the chain, and to get up to that little old rock from the old caldera rim. And to my surprise, I found a megapode, even on this barren island. In the early days of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, there was but one conservation officer for the whole of what is now the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. From Yap, I was hired by the TTPI to work with Natsa Sidern, who was creating an environmental education program, Environmental Protection Board. My first job was to put together a grant to support the project. Later, I became the staff ecologist, thus increasing the conservation-oriented staff in the TTPI by 100% to 2 people. In those days, there were some laws, but they were not widely known or enforced. The military, however, had to comply with a federal law requiring environmental impact statements. I recall an EIS that was done in regard to using the little southernmost uninhabited island of Farayon de Medmeja for bombing practice. We here know how important remote uninhabited islands are as nesting sites for seabirds. The EIS, however, pointed out that birds on the island could fly, and that they would fly away when the bombs came down and not be harmed by the bombing. I won't go into my years working beyond the Marianas, but in the interest of promoting more effective conservation, I'll end with some lessons learned over the years. First, don't expect that others share your vision of conservation. 2, don't assume that people in a position to take effective action on conservation issues will read your carefully prepared report with its well-considered data and ideas. But don't worry, it'll be important someday. 3, do include an executive summary free from professional jargon, along with pictures and easily understood graphs and diagrams. 4, do socialize and discuss your findings with people that make things happen. 5, if you're not very social, team up with the local community leader. This can make a huge difference. 6, don't despair thinking that we're not making progress. Sometimes it takes time, even a generation. Keep at it. 7, keep learning. Someday, those who didn't heed your rantings about we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't be doing that will turn around and you will be asked, what should we do? That's harder. Be prepared. Thank you.